Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Story 1, A Family's Tragic End. It was a cold, quiet Christmas Eve in a small suburban town. The snow had blanketed the streets, and houses were aglow with colorful lights. Inside one particular home, however, the festive spirit had long since been replaced by tension. James Carter, a 42-year-old man, sat alone in the living room. His wife, Emily, and their 2 children were upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing within him. James had always been a hard-working man, but over the past few months, things had taken a dark turn. Financial struggles and a failing marriage had left him feeling helpless. But what truly fueled his rage was the belief that Emily was seeing someone else. He had no proof, just whispers and late-night phone calls that she brushed off as work-related. As the hours passed, James's thoughts spiraled. The laughter of his children drifting down from upstairs, once a source of comfort, now grated on his nerves. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, his mind racing with a dangerous mix of anger and despair. Emily came downstairs to check on him, her face tired but kind. "James, it's late. Come to bed," she said softly. But he didn't respond. He just stared at the fireplace, his jaw clenched. "James, please. It's Christmas. Let's just try to enjoy the night," she pleaded. But her words only added fuel to the fire. In his twisted mind, her calm demeanor was proof of her betrayal. When Emily returned upstairs, James made a decision that would forever change their lives. He opened the drawer of the side table, pulling out a handgun he had bought years ago for protection. His hands trembled as he held it, but his mind was set. He climbed the stairs slowly, the creak of each step echoing in the silent house. His children's laughter had quieted, replaced by the soft hum of a Christmas movie playing in their room. James pushed open the door to the master bedroom. Emily looked up from her book, her face a mix of confusion and fear as she saw the gun in his hand. "James, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. But he didn't answer. His mind was clouded, his vision red. The argument that followed was brief but intense. Emily tried to reason with him, tried to calm him down, but it was too late. A loud bang shattered the stillness of the night. Emily collapsed onto the bed, her eyes wide with shock. Hearing the commotion, the children ran into the room. "Mommy? Daddy," their voices were small and scared. James turned to them, tears streaming down his face. For a moment, he hesitated. But in his mind, he had convinced himself that this was the only way to protect them from the pain he felt. Another shot rang out, and then another. The house fell silent, the cheerful glow of the Christmas lights outside a cruel contrast to the horror within. James stood there for a moment, his breathing ragged. Then, he turned the gun on himself. The next morning, neighbors noticed the house was eerily quiet. The children were usually up early, playing in the snow. When no one answered the door, they called the police. What the officers found inside was a scene of unspeakable tragedy. The bodies of Emily, the children, and James lay still, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas celebration that would never be finished. The community was left in shock. No one had seen this coming. James was always polite, always seemed like a devoted husband and father. But behind closed doors, the cracks in their lives had grown too wide to mend. In the weeks that followed, stories began to circulate. Some neighbors claimed they heard laughter coming from the house at night, even though it stood empty. Others swore they saw shadows moving past the windows. The house was eventually sold, but the new owners didn't stay long. They complained of strange occurrences, doors opening on their own, the faint sound of footsteps, and a child's laughter echoing in the halls. Local legends grew around the house. Some said James's spirit lingered, trapped by guilt. Others believed it was the children, innocent souls unable to move on. The house still stands today, a chilling reminder of that fateful Christmas Eve. Most avoid it, especially during the holiday season. But every now and then, someone claims to see a light flicker in a window or hear the faint sound of a Christmas carol playing inside. For those who live nearby, it's a story they'll never forget, a tale of love turned to jealousy, and a holiday meant for joy overshadowed by unspeakable loss. Story 2, The Party That Turned Nightmare. It was a lively Christmas Eve in the heart of the city. Festive decorations adorned every corner, and the air was filled with a chill that nipped at the faces of those braving the night. The city had a magical quality during this time of year, with twinkling lights strung across streets and the faint sound of carolers in the distance. Sarah Jenkins felt a warm glow in her chest as she walked, the joy of the holiday season still fresh from the evening's celebrations. She had spent the night at a close friend's Christmas party, surrounded by laughter, music, and the soft clinking of glasses. The party had been vibrant, filled with familiar faces, cozy conversations, and the smell of mulled wine and cinnamon wafting through the air. It was the kind of night that made her feel alive, as if nothing in the world could go wrong. Leaving the party, she felt a slight chill as the icy air greeted her outside. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and adjusted her scarf, a small puff of breath escaping her lips in the freezing air. The streets were quieter now, most people having retired to their homes to prepare for Christmas morning. She loved these moments of solitude, where the world seemed to pause and breathe. The snow began to fall more steadily, blanketing the roads in a soft, pristine white. It crunched beneath her boots as she walked, her pace unhurried. Sarah's thoughts lingered on the evening, how her friends had teased her for still being single, how Rachel had insisted she try the eggnog, and how she'd laughed so hard her stomach hurt. The route home was familiar, a path she had walked countless times before. It was a straight shot through a residential neighborhood, dotted with townhouses and glowing Christmas trees visible through frosted windows. Normally, she found this walk comforting. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air. The first sign was the eerie silence. The usual hum of the city, the distant honk of car horns, the chatter of late-night revelers, was absent. It was as if the snow had muffled every sound, leaving only the soft crunch of her boots to break the quiet. She glanced around, her senses suddenly more alert. Ahead of her, the street stretched out, illuminated by dim streetlights. Shadows danced on the edges of the pavement, cast by the swaying branches of bare trees. Sarah felt a slight unease creeping in but shook it off. It was just the quiet, she told herself. She wasn't used to it. Her unease grew when she passed an alley and caught sight of a figure leaning against the wall. The man was mostly obscured by shadows, his head bowed, and his posture oddly still. Sarah's steps faltered for a brief moment before she forced herself to keep walking, her heartbeat quickening. She didn't want to be paranoid. After all, this was a city, and people were everywhere. Perhaps he was just taking a break from the cold, waiting for someone, or even homeless and seeking shelter. But something about the way he moved, or rather, didn't move, felt off. As she continued walking, the sensation of being watched prickled the back of her neck. She resisted the urge to turn around, telling herself she was overthinking. The soft glow of Christmas lights from the houses around her should have been comforting, but they only seemed to deepen the shadows in the corners of her vision. The sound of her boots in the snow seemed louder now, echoing in her ears. She tried to focus on her surroundings, scanning the familiar landmarks, the post box on the corner, the wrought iron fence of a nearby yard. but her thoughts kept drifting back to the figure in the alley. Finally, she couldn't resist anymore. Sarah glanced over her shoulder. To her dismay, the man was no longer standing in the alley. Her pulse quickened. She turned back around, picking up her pace slightly, her breath visible in the freezing air. The silence pressed in on her, heavier than before. She tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, mentally chastising herself for being so jumpy. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. It was then that she heard it, a faint crunch of snow behind her. It was subtle, barely audible, but distinct enough to send a jolt through her. She wasn't alone. Her instinct screamed at her to keep walking, to act normal, but her heart was racing now, and her palms felt clammy despite the cold. She fought the urge to look back again, knowing that acknowledging whoever was behind her might escalate the situation. Her thoughts raced, each one more alarming than the last. Was it the man from the alley? Was he following her? Why hadn't she called for a cab? Why had she insisted on walking home alone tonight? The crunching grew louder, the steps deliberate and slow. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. It was as if they wanted her to know they were there, wanted her to feel the fear that was now gripping her chest. Sarah's breaths came faster, her pace quickening. She was nearing a cross street where a convenience store's neon sign glowed faintly in the distance. She focused on it, her sole beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Her mind was a whirlwind of scenarios. Should she run? Should she confront whoever was behind her? Her hand tightened around her purse strap, her fingers shaking. Just as she reached the corner, she dared to glance back one more time. The street behind her was empty, but the shadows seemed darker, thicker. The figure was gone, but the sense of being followed remained, gnawing at her. She took a shaky breath, telling herself she was safe now, that she was imagining things. But the faint echo of footsteps in her memory told her otherwise. The convenience store's bell jingled as she pushed the door open, the warm light spilling out onto the snow. The cashier looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. Sarah managed a weak smile, but her heart was still racing. The party had been vibrant, filled with familiar faces, cozy conversations, and the comforting smells of Christmas. Sarah remembered arriving earlier that evening, greeted by a warm hug from her best friend Rachel, the host. The apartment was beautifully decorated, garlands of evergreen hung on the walls, fairy lights twinkled across the ceiling, and a massive Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner, its ornaments catching the soft glow of the room. Rachel had gone all out this year. The table was laden with delicious food, roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and a variety of desserts that tempted everyone who passed by. Sarah could still taste the sweetness of the sugar cookies she'd snacked on, their frosting artfully designed in festive shapes. The laughter in the room had been infectious. Groups of friends shared jokes, couples whispered sweet nothings, and someone in the corner strummed a guitar, adding a melodic undertone to the chatter. Sarah had floated between conversations, feeling at ease among her friends, her cheeks flushed with happiness and a bit of wine. Rachel's parties were always the highlight of the season. Sarah loved the way Rachel made everyone feel welcome, ensuring no one stood alone for too long. She had even introduced Sarah to a few new faces, including a charming man who had shared a few stories about his recent travels. The evening passed in a blur of joyous moments. Sarah had found herself at the center of a group, recounting a funny story from work that had everyone laughing. For a brief moment, she had felt completely carefree, her worries melting away in the warmth of friendship and holiday cheer. At one point, someone suggested a game of charades. Sarah joined in, her competitive side coming out as she mimed ridiculous scenarios, earning cheers and applause from her team. The room had been filled with an energy that made it hard to leave, even as the night grew late. The smell of mulled wine and cinnamon candles lingered in the air, adding to the festive atmosphere. Sarah remembered standing by the window with Rachel, watching the snow begin to fall. They had shared a quiet moment, talking about their plans for the new year, the sound of laughter and music fading into the background. Rachel, ever the attentive host, had insisted Sarah try a cup of her homemade eggnog. It was deliciously creamy, with just the right hint of nutmeg and a splash of rum that warmed Sarah from the inside out. She teased Rachel about keeping the recipe a secret, vowing to steal it someday. As the hours slipped by, the party began to wind down. Guests started saying their goodbyes, bundling up in coats and scarves before stepping out into the snowy night. Sarah found herself lingering, reluctant to leave the warmth and comfort of the gathering. Rachel had hugged her tightly before she left, whispering, "Call me when you get home." It was a small gesture, but one that Sarah appreciated. She promised she would, giving Rachel a playful wave as she stepped out into the cold. The contrast between the lively warmth of the party and the quiet stillness of the night was stark. Sarah felt the chill immediately, the snow crunching under her boots as she adjusted her scarf. She glanced back at Rachel's building, the windows glowing softly against the dark sky. The streets were almost deserted, a rare sight in the usually bustling city. The silence was calming at first, a peaceful reprieve from the noise and activity of the party. Sarah stuffed her hands into her pockets and began walking, the cold air sharpening her senses. She replayed the evening in her mind, smiling at the memory of Rachel's antics and the conversations she'd shared with friends. Her heart felt light, her worries distant. It was moments like these that made her love the holiday season, the togetherness, the laughter, the magic. As she walked, she thought about the man she'd met at the party. His stories of traveling to remote places had intrigued her, and she found herself wondering if she should have stayed a little longer to talk to him. There had been something genuine about his smile, something she couldn't quite place. She looked up at the falling snow, marveling at how it transformed the city into something out of a postcard. The streetlights cast a golden glow on the ground, the snowflakes sparkling as they danced in the light. It was a picture-perfect Christmas Eve. The cold was biting now, seeping through her gloves and making her wish she had brought a thicker scarf. Still, she felt content. There was something comforting about being alone in the quiet of the night, her thoughts her only company. Sarah checked her phone briefly, noting the time. It was later than she had realized, but she was only a few blocks from home. She wasn't worried. This was her neighborhood, and she knew it well. The familiarity brought a sense of security, even in the stillness of the hour. She noticed the occasional windows still lit up, catching glimpses of families gathered around Christmas trees or couples sipping hot cocoa by the fire. It made her think of her own childhood, of the time she and her parents had spent decorating their tree and singing carols. The cold stung her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She felt alive, her senses heightened by the chill and the beauty of the snowy night. This was her favorite time of year, and tonight had been the kind of evening she'd remember for a long time. As she turned a corner onto a quieter street, she couldn't help but feel a small twinge of melancholy. The party was over, and the walk home was nearly done. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the joy of the evening and the anticipation of Christmas morning. Sarah turned onto the last stretch of her route home, a street that was quieter and darker than the rest. The snowfall had grown heavier, muffling every sound except the faint crunch of her boots against the ground. Her breath misted in the air, the cold gnawing at her exposed face. She glanced around, noticing how the streetlights barely penetrated the swirling snow. Despite the serenity of the snowfall, she couldn't shake the unease that had crept into her earlier thoughts. She blamed the lingering image of the man she'd seen leaning in the alley. It's just your imagination, she told herself, quickening her pace slightly. The houses on this street were older, their windows dark and curtains drawn tight. The festive cheer she'd passed earlier seemed to vanish here, replaced by a sense of isolation. Sarah checked her phone for the time again, finding comfort in its soft glow. It was just past midnight, officially Christmas Day. She thought of calling Rachel, just to hear a familiar voice, but decided against it. Rachel would be tired from hosting the party, and Sarah didn't want to seem paranoid over what was probably nothing. Still, she kept her phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over the home screen. The faint sound of snow crunching behind her stopped her in her tracks. It wasn't her own steps, the rhythm was off. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to hear through the heavy silence. But the sound didn't come again. She turned slowly, scanning the street behind her. It was empty, the snow untouched except for her own trail of footprints. The trees lining the street stood still, their bare branches draped with snow. She let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at her own imagination. Turning back, she resumed walking, trying to shake the paranoia that was growing stronger with each passing minute. She pulled her scarf higher over her face, wishing the walk home would end already. Another crunch behind her sent a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone was following her. She didn't dare turn around again, her instincts screaming at her to keep moving. Her heart raced as her mind scrambled for a plan. Should she run? Should she call someone? She glanced ahead, searching for signs of life, a lit window, a passing car, anything. But the street remained eerily empty. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closing the distance between her and whoever was behind her. Sarah tightened her grip on her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency dial. She couldn't let panic take over. She needed to stay calm, to think clearly. As she reached the next intersection, she saw a small park up ahead, its pathways dimly lit by old-fashioned lampposts. Cutting through it would be a shortcut to her apartment, but it was a risk. The park was secluded, and if someone was following her, it might make her even more vulnerable. She decided against it, sticking to the main road. She prayed silently that someone would appear, a late-night jogger, a couple walking home, even a car passing by. But the street remained deserted, the snow muffling any sounds of the world around her. The footsteps behind her suddenly stopped, and the silence was deafening. She dared to glance back, her breath catching in her throat. A shadowy figure stood several yards away, their face obscured by the darkness. They didn't move, didn't speak. Fear surged through her, and she turned back around, forcing her legs to move faster. She was almost running now, her boots slipping slightly on the snow-covered pavement. Her mind raced, each thought more terrifying than the last. She passed another alley and risked a quick glance down it, hoping for a place to hide. But the alley was pitch black, its depths unknown. She couldn't bring herself to stop, to face whatever, or whoever, was behind her. Her building was only 2 blocks away now. She focused on it like a beacon, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She could make it. She just had to keep moving. The figure was following her again. She could hear the deliberate crunch of their steps, steady and unhurried, as if they knew she couldn't escape. Her fear turned to anger. Why me? She thought, gripping her phone tightly. She turned onto her street, the familiar sight of her apartment building coming into view. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a new fear. The figure was still following her. If they saw her enter her building, would they wait for her? Reaching her door, she fumbled with her keys, her hands trembling. She could hear the footsteps getting closer, the crunch of snow echoing in her ears. Finally, She managed to unlock the door, slipping inside and slamming it shut behind her. She pressed her back against the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely think. Through the small peephole, she saw the figure standing at the bottom of the steps, their face hidden by a hood. They didn't move, didn't try to follow her inside. Sarah's breaths came in short, panicked gasps as she watched them. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the swirling snow. She sank to the floor, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The safety of her apartment felt like a fragile barrier, the thin walls and locked doors suddenly inadequate against the fear that lingered. She double-checked the locks on her door and all her windows, her mind replaying the events of the night in vivid detail. Collapsing onto her couch, she pulled a blanket around herself, her body still shivering. She wanted to call Rachel, to tell her what had happened, but she didn't know how to explain it. What could she say? That a stranger had followed her home on Christmas Eve? Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from Rachel. Hope you got home safe. Merry Christmas, love you. Sarah stared at the message, her emotions overwhelming her. She typed back a quick response, forcing herself to sound cheerful. Home safe. Merry Christmas to you too. But she wasn't safe. Not really. The night's events had shaken her deeply, and she knew she wouldn't sleep tonight. She couldn't stop wondering who the figure was, or why they had followed her. The sound of footsteps echoed in her mind, relentless and haunting. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her, staring out the window at the falling snow. The city felt different now, its beauty tainted by fear. As the hours passed, the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness. The snow-covered streets looked serene, almost peaceful, as if the night's events had been a bad dream. But Sarah knew better. Christmas morning arrived, but the joy she had felt earlier was gone. The memory of the figure in the snow would stay with her, a chilling reminder that even on the most magical nights, darkness could lurk just out of sight. Story 3, The Creature in the Christmas Tree. It started like any other Christmas morning. The Johnson family had gathered around the living room, their laughter filling the air as the scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the house. Their Christmas tree, a magnificent fir that they had picked out together from a local lot, stood proudly by the window, decorated with shimmering ornaments and twinkling lights. Little did they know, something unusual was hiding within its dense, fragrant branches. The tree had been the highlight of their holiday preparations. They had gone out as a family 2 weeks earlier, searching for the perfect one. It had taken nearly an hour, with each member of the family offering an opinion. 8-year-old Lily had insisted on a tree that looked like the ones in fairy tales, while her teenage brother, Max, had been more concerned about how quickly they could finish. When they found the tree, it had felt perfect. It was tall, with thick, lush branches, its needles a deep green that smelled of the forest. Even the vendor had complimented their choice, saying it was one of the best he'd seen that season. They had tied it to the roof of their car, laughing as they struggled to secure it against the gusting wind. Back home, the tree had been a centerpiece of excitement. Lily had insisted on helping to string the lights, her tiny hands carefully maneuvering around the branches. Max had been less enthusiastic but eventually joined in, hanging a few ornaments before retreating to his room. Their parents, Emily and Tom, watched from the couch, sipping cocoa and feeling a rare sense of family togetherness. In the following days, the tree had become a source of comfort. Its soft glow lit the room every evening as the family gathered to watch Christmas movies. Emily often found herself staring at it, marveling at its beauty. It seemed to embody everything she loved about the holiday: warmth, togetherness, and a touch of magic. On Christmas Eve, as the family placed the last presents under the tree, they noticed something odd. Lily pointed it out first, her curious eyes scanning the lower branches. "Mommy," she whispered, "I think something's moving in the tree." Emily had laughed it off, assuming it was her daughter's imagination. She crouched down to look but saw nothing unusual. The branches swayed slightly, but that was likely from the air vent nearby. "It's just the wind, sweetheart," she said, smoothing Lily's hair. But that night, as the family slept, strange noises filled the house. Emily awoke to a faint rustling sound coming from the living room. She nudged Tom awake, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He groaned, dismissing it as the tree settling or a draft. The sound persisted, though soft but deliberate. It wasn't just the branches swaying or the ornaments clinking together. It was something alive, moving within the confines of the tree. Emily stayed awake for hours, listening, her imagination running wild. By morning, the sounds had stopped, and Emily convinced herself it had been nothing. She busied herself in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while the children excitedly tore into their presents. The living room was a picture of holiday cheer, wrapping paper strewn across the floor, Lily squealing over her new doll, Max smirking at the gaming console he'd unwrapped. It wasn't until Max leaned in to grab another present that he froze. "Mom," he said cautiously, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something in the tree." Emily rushed over, her heart racing. Max pointed to a dense cluster of branches near the bottom. The needles seemed to quiver ever so slightly, but there was no breeze. She knelt down, peering into the darkness between the branches. At first, she saw nothing but the shadowy depths of the tree. Then, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, faint and otherworldly. Emily gasped, stumbling backward. The children crowded around her, their curiosity outweighing their fear. "What is it?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with excitement and unease. Emily couldn't answer. The eyes blinked, disappearing momentarily before reappearing in a different part of the tree. Tom joined them, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern when he saw the panic on Emily's face. "What's going on?" he demanded. She pointed wordlessly at the tree, her hand trembling. Tom squinted into the branches, his brows furrowing. "It's probably a squirrel or something," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But even as he spoke, he didn't sound convinced. Something about the way the eyes moved was unnatural. Max grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, determined to investigate. He shined the beam into the tree, illuminating its interior. For a moment, they saw nothing but the intricate network of branches and ornaments. Then, the creature emerged. It was small, no larger than a cat, with fur that shimmered faintly in the light. Its eyes, still glowing, seemed to pierce through them, radiating a strange intelligence. It clung to the branches with sharp, claw-like fingers, its movements fluid and unnervingly silent. Lily squealed in both fear and delight. "It's like a Christmas elf," she exclaimed, but Emily knew better. There was nothing joyful or whimsical about the creature. It was watching them, its gaze unblinking, as if calculating its next move. Tom grabbed a broom, his instincts kicking in. "We need to get it out of here," he said firmly, advancing toward the tree. The creature hissed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down Emily's spine. "Be careful," Emily warned, clutching Lily protectively. Tom poked at the branches with the broom, but the creature darted higher into the tree, moving with an eerie speed. Max, emboldened by adrenaline, suggested opening the front door to let it escape. Emily hesitated, unsure if letting it loose was a good idea. What if it came back? Or worse, what if it wasn't alone? Tom finally managed to dislodge the creature, sending it scrambling down the tree and across the living room. It paused near the door, its glowing eyes locking onto Emily's for one haunting moment before it darted outside. For a long time, the family sat in stunned silence, the room's festive atmosphere now replaced with an uneasy tension. The tree, once a symbol of their holiday joy, now seemed ominous, its beauty masking something dark and inexplicable. "What was that?" Max finally asked, breaking the silence. No one had an answer. Emily wrapped her arms around Lily, her protective instincts in overdrive. Tom tried to rationalize it. "Probably some kind of wild animal," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "Maybe it hitched a ride on the tree from the lot." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. She replayed the image of its glowing eyes, its almost human-like movements, and the way it had watched them, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating stare. That night, Emily and Tom debated whether to get rid of the tree. The children were already asleep, but Emily couldn't bring herself to let it stay. Tom reluctantly dragged it outside, leaving it on the curb for collection. Even with the tree gone, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening for the faintest sound of movement, her mind plagued by the memory of the creature. She couldn't help but wonder if it had truly left, or if it was waiting to return. It had taken nearly an hour for the Johnson family to select their Christmas tree that year, and every moment of it had been a mix of excitement and playful bickering. The small tree lot was bustling with other families, their laughter blending with the hum of Christmas carols playing over a crackling speaker. The air was thick with the scent of fresh pine, and snowflakes danced lazily in the cold December breeze. Lily, the youngest, darted from tree to tree, her red mittens flailing as she called out suggestions. "This one's perfect," she cried, pointing to a crooked, sparse tree that leaned awkwardly to one side. Her parents chuckled, trying to redirect her enthusiasm toward more reasonable options. Max, her teenage brother, stood off to the side, his arms crossed and his breath visible in the icy air. "Can we just pick one and go?" he grumbled. "It's freezing out here." Despite his protests, there was a faint glimmer of interest in his eyes as he watched Lily's excitement. Tom, their father, was inspecting a tall fir near the edge of the lot. "What about this one?" he asked, turning to Emily, his wife, for approval. She tilted her head, considering it, but Lily was already pulling her toward another tree. "This one, Mommy." "It's perfect," Lily insisted, pointing to a tree that was slightly shorter but fuller, its branches lush and symmetrical. Emily knelt beside her, brushing snow off the tag attached to the trunk. "This one's not bad," she said, glancing back at Tom. "What do you think?" Tom walked over, inspecting the tree with a critical eye. He shook the branches gently, watching as a light dusting of snow fell to the ground. "It's solid," he said with a nod. "What do you think, Max?" Max shrugged, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. "It's a tree. Can we just get it and go?" Emily laughed, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I think we have a winner," she said, reaching for Tom's hand. Together, they signaled to one of the workers, a cheerful man in a bright orange jacket. The worker carried the tree to a small clearing where he prepared it for transport. Lily watched in fascination as he bundled it in netting, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is it going to be okay, Daddy?" she asked. "It'll be fine, sweetheart," Tom assured her, patting her on the head. "It's just to keep the branches safe while we take it home." The process of tying the tree to the roof of their car was far from smooth. Tom struggled with the rope, his fingers stiff from the cold, while Max reluctantly helped hold the tree steady. Emily stood to the side, snapping photos of the chaos, her laughter echoing through the lot. "Hold it tighter, Max." Tom grunted, pulling the rope taut. "If this thing falls off, it's your fault." Max rolled his eyes but complied, muttering under his breath about how he'd rather be anywhere else. Lily, meanwhile, was twirling in circles nearby, her boots crunching against the snow. She hummed along to the Christmas carols, oblivious to the minor drama unfolding around her. Finally, the tree was secured, and the family piled into the car. As they drove home, the tree swayed slightly on the roof, the sound of the ropes creaking adding to the holiday ambience. Emily turned in her seat to look at the kids. "You know," she said, smiling, "picking out the tree is my favorite part of Christmas. It's like the start of all the magic." Lily nodded enthusiastically. "It's like the tree is the heart of Christmas," she declared, her eyes sparkling. Even Max managed a small smile, though he quickly looked away, pretending to check his phone. Back at home, the challenge of getting the tree through the front door began. Tom and Max wrestled with it, the branches scraping against the doorframe as Emily and Lily offered mostly unhelpful advice from the sidelines. "Turn it sideways," Emily called. "I am turning it sideways," Tom snapped, his voice strained. Eventually, they managed to get the tree into the living room, where it stood proudly in its designated corner. The room seemed to transform instantly, the scent of pine filling the air and the anticipation of decorating buzzing between them. Lily danced around the tree, clapping her hands. "It's perfect," she squealed. "It's the best tree ever." Emily knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It is perfect," she agreed, glancing up at Tom. "Good choice, team." As the evening went on, the family worked together to decorate the tree. Boxes of ornaments were brought out from storage, each one holding memories of past Christmases. Lily was in charge of hanging the smaller ornaments near the bottom, while Max reluctantly took on the task of stringing the lights. Tom adjusted the tree stand, making sure it was secure, while Emily placed the star at the top. When they were finished, they stepped back to admire their work. The tree glowed softly, its lights casting warm shadows across the room. "That's it," Tom said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Christmas has officially begun." As the days passed, the tree became a centerpiece of their holiday traditions. It stood tall and proud, its ornaments glinting in the soft light of the living room. The family gathered around it each night, basking in its glow and the sense of togetherness it seemed to bring. Lily often sat beneath its branches, pretending it was a magical forest. She would tell stories to her dolls, weaving tales of enchanted trees and Christmas miracles. Max, though he never admitted it, found himself spending more time in the living room, drawn to the tree's quiet beauty. He would sit on the couch, scrolling through his phone, but occasionally, his eyes would drift to the twinkling lights. Emily and Tom, too, felt the tree's magic. They often found themselves sitting together in the evenings, talking softly while the kids were asleep. The tree, they agreed, was the best they'd ever had. But as the holiday approached, the tree began to take on an unsettling quality. The family couldn't quite put their finger on it, but something about it felt off. It wasn't until Christmas Eve that they would discover the truth hidden within its branches. It was the day after Christmas when the Johnson family first noticed something strange about the tree. The living room had been quiet, the excitement of the holiday having settled into a peaceful lull. The children were playing with their new gifts, their laughter echoing through the house as Tom and Emily enjoyed a rare moment of peace, sipping coffee and reading their books. At first, it was Lily who noticed it. She had been sitting on the couch, surrounded by her dolls, when her eyes drifted to the Christmas tree in the corner of the room. She furrowed her brow and leaned forward, squinting at something near the bottom of the tree. "Mommy, look," Lily called, her voice sharp with excitement and curiosity. Emily looked up from her book, wondering what her daughter had found now. She followed Lily's gaze to the tree. There, nestled among the lower branches, something caught the light. It was small, perhaps no bigger than the palm of her hand. At first, Emily thought it might be a forgotten ornament, perhaps a decoration that had fallen out of place. But as her eyes focused on it, she realized it wasn't an ornament at all. The object was furry, with a patch of dark, matted fur that looked almost like a small animal. The fur shimmered faintly in the soft glow of the tree lights, giving it an otherworldly appearance. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the strange sight. "Lily," she said softly, trying to remain calm. "Stay right there. Don't touch it." Lily's wide eyes met her mother's, and the little girl nodded without a word, her small fingers frozen midair as she reached for her doll. Emily stood up slowly, her heart beginning to race. She approached the tree, carefully stepping around the scattered presents and gift wrap that littered the floor. As she got closer, the creature, or whatever it was, became more distinct. It was nestled deep among the branches, partially hidden by the foliage. Its eyes, though small, glowed faintly in the dim room, casting an eerie light on the surrounding pine needles. They weren't the innocent eyes of a pet or even a woodland creature. They were cold and calculating, like something far more intelligent. Emily reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the tree. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she tried to steady her breath. It was just an animal, she thought. Maybe a squirrel or something small that had gotten into the house somehow. But as her hand neared the branch where the creature was hiding, it moved. The furred body shifted slightly, and the eyes blinked, narrowing in a way that made Emily's blood run cold. For a moment, she froze, unsure what to do next. She quickly turned to look at Tom, who had just walked into the room, carrying a box of ornaments that needed to be packed away. "Tom," Emily said urgently, her voice low. "There's something in the tree." Tom's eyebrows furrowed in confusion as he approached her. "What do you mean?" "Something's inside," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the strange creature. "It's not an animal. It's something else." Tom's expression shifted to one of skepticism, but he followed her gaze to the tree. He squinted, his mouth open in disbelief. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, taking a cautious step forward. He reached for the flashlight on the coffee table and shone it on the creature. The beam illuminated its small, furry body and glowing eyes. The creature didn't move, but it seemed to be watching them, its gaze unwavering. Tom took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. "That's not normal," he said quietly, his voice filled with unease. "It looks wrong." Emily nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine. "I don't know what it is, but I don't think we should keep it in here." As they stood there, trying to process what they were seeing, Lily spoke up from the couch. "Is it a Christmas elf?" she asked innocently, her eyes wide with wonder. Emily turned to look at her daughter, a sense of dread settling over her. "No, sweetie, it's not an elf," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is." Tom moved toward the tree, cautiously examining it. He grabbed the broom from the corner of the room, intending to gently prod the creature out of the tree. As his hand reached for the handle, the creature seemed to stir. It let out a soft hiss, a sound that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand up. The noise was guttural and unsettling, far from anything they had ever heard before. Tom stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening. "Did it just make a sound?" Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes. And it didn't sound like anything I've ever heard." With a deep breath, Tom took a step closer, the broom held out in front of him. As he approached the tree, the creature shifted again, moving higher into the branches with a speed that seemed unnatural. It was as though it was almost flying rather than climbing. "Be careful," Emily warned, her voice barely audible. Tom tried to shake off his unease. "I'm just going to get it out of here," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The creature seemed to be watching him, its eyes glowing brighter with each movement. Suddenly, without warning, the creature darted down from the branches. It moved so quickly that Tom didn't have time to react. He barely managed to swing the broom to block its path before it darted behind the couch. The family stood frozen in shock. Tom quickly turned the broom over, attempting to nudge the creature out from behind the furniture, but it was gone. "It's gone," Emily whispered, her heart racing. "Where did it go?" They looked around the room, scanning every corner, but the creature had disappeared. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it an animal that somehow got trapped in the tree? Or was it something more sinister? "Mom?" Lily's voice broke the silence. Emily turned to her daughter, who was staring at her with wide, innocent eyes. "What was it, Mommy? What was in the tree?" Emily hesitated, her thoughts racing. She didn't want to frighten Lily, but she couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation. I don't know, sweetie," Emily said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "But we're going to find out." Tom nodded, his jaw clenched. "We're going to get to the bottom of this. But first, let's check the tree again." With a renewed sense of urgency, Tom and Emily approached the tree together. They examined every branch, carefully inspecting the needles and ornaments for any signs of the creature. But there was nothing. The tree seemed perfectly normal now, as if the creature had never been there. The family stood in stunned silence, the air heavy with unease. "Do you think it's gone for good?" Max asked, his voice quiet. Emily didn't know how to answer. The next day, the family tried to put the strange events of the previous night out of their minds. They went about their usual holiday routines, decorating cookies, wrapping last-minute presents, and watching old Christmas movies. But the memory of what happened with the creature in the tree lingered, a heavy weight that none of them could shake off. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, the tension in the air was palpable. Max, who was usually the first to crack a joke or break the silence, was unusually quiet. He pushed his food around on his plate, his eyes distant as if lost in thought. Lily, too, seemed distracted, her usual cheerfulness absent as she poked at her mashed potatoes. "Something's not right," Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence. She set down her fork, her gaze shifting toward the corner of the room where the tree stood. "I feel like we're being watched." Tom, who had been absent-mindedly stirring his soup, looked up. His expression was weary, as if the weight of the strange occurrences had worn him down over the past day. "I know what you mean," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been thinking about it all day. What if that thing wasn't just some animal? What if it's something else?" Max looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed. "You're saying it's something supernatural?" His tone was skeptical, but there was a hint of fear in his voice. "Come on, Dad. It's just a weird animal or something." Emily shook her head, her eyes darting back to the tree. "I don't think so. It didn't feel right. It moved too fast, too unnaturally. And its eyes, those glowing eyes. I can't stop thinking about them." Max sighed and slouched further into his seat, but even he couldn't deny the unease that had taken root in his chest. Maybe it was just some weird glitch. "You know, in the light, things can look a lot different." "Maybe," Tom said slowly. "But there's something off about this whole thing. We need to figure out what's going on." Lily, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Maybe it's an elf. Like in the storybook. They live in trees, right?" Her voice was full of the innocent hope that comes with childhood, but there was an underlying tremor in her words that betrayed her fear. Emily forced a smile, trying to ease her daughter's worries. "No, sweetheart. I don't think it's an elf. But we'll make sure the tree's safe." The conversation fell silent after that. The rest of dinner passed in a subdued haze, the family's unease hanging over them like a dark cloud. It felt as if the walls were closing in, as if the Christmas cheer that had once filled their home had been replaced by a creeping dread. After dinner, Tom and Emily decided to inspect the tree again. They weren't sure what they were looking for. Perhaps they thought they might find some clue that would explain the strange creature, or that something might seem out of place. As they approached the tree, the soft glow of the Christmas lights felt unnervingly bright, casting long, strange shadows around the room. Max followed them reluctantly, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the creature. "Do you think it's still in there?" he asked, his voice tense. "I don't know," Tom replied, glancing nervously at the tree. "But we're going to find out." Emily stood just a little too close to the tree, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a branch. She moved the needles carefully, checking every inch for anything that might hint at the creature's return. The space between the branches was deep, and she couldn't help but feel that something was lurking just out of sight. Max, feeling an odd sense of dread, took a step back. His eyes remained fixed on the tree, his thoughts racing. The creature had disappeared so quickly the night before, but now that it was gone, it felt as though its presence had somehow marked the tree with something malevolent. He couldn't explain it, but there was a thick feeling in the air, a weight that pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, Lily's voice interrupted the heavy silence. "Mommy, I think I saw something," she whispered from behind him. Her voice was quiet, almost a tremble, but the words sent a shiver through everyone present. Tom spun around, his heart skipping a beat. "What? Where?" Lily pointed toward the tree, her small finger trembling as she motioned to the shadows under the lowest branches. "There, Mommy. Right there. I saw it move." Emily rushed over to where Lily was pointing, her heart racing. She peered under the tree, but all she saw was the pile of discarded wrapping paper and a few ornaments that had fallen off earlier. Her breath came out in short gasps as she tried to steady herself. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Lily," Emily said gently, kneeling to her daughter's level. "Are you sure you saw something?" Lily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure, Mommy. I saw it." Tom stepped closer to the tree, his eyes scanning the area carefully. "It could be nothing, Emily," he said quietly. "It could just be your imagination." But even as he said the words, he knew they didn't ring true. The air in the room was too thick, and his instincts told him that something was very wrong. Lily stood up, her face pale as she took a step back from the tree. "I don't want to be here," she said softly, her voice filled with fear. "I don't like the tree anymore, Daddy. I don't want to look at it." Emily stood up quickly, pulling her daughter into her arms. "It's okay, Lily. We'll make sure nothing happens to you." Tom's mind raced. He needed to understand what was going on. They couldn't just ignore it any longer, but they also didn't want to scare the kids more than they already were. He turned to Emily, his voice low. "We should call someone, maybe an expert. I don't know what we're dealing with here." Before Emily could respond, Max spoke up again. "Do you think it could be some kind of animal again? Maybe a raccoon or something?" Tom shook his head. "I don't think so. This isn't like anything we've ever seen before." Suddenly, the lights on the tree flickered, causing everyone to jump. The flicker was followed by a strange buzzing sound, almost like static, but louder. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably. The hair on the back of Tom's neck stood up. Something wasn't right, and he could feel it deep in his bones. Emily quickly grabbed a blanket from the couch, wrapping it around Lily as they both stepped back away from the tree. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, trying to comfort her daughter. "We're just going to stay away from the tree for now." Tom stood at the edge of the room, staring at the flickering lights. His heart pounded as his mind raced. The creature, whatever it was, had been real, and it seemed to be tied to the tree itself. He could feel it, like an invisible presence that filled the room, watching them from every corner. Max, his face pale, turned to his father. "Dad, are we going to call the police? This is really freaky." Tom hesitated. He didn't know what to do. It wasn't like they could call the police for a strange creature in the tree, especially when no one could even prove it had ever been there. But deep down, he knew that something was watching them, waiting. And it wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. "Not yet," Tom replied, his voice tight. "We need to figure out what's going on. I'm not leaving this house until I know what that thing is." The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. They could hear the soft hum of the tree's lights, almost like a whisper. Emily's eyes widened as she glanced up at the tree. It was almost as if the tree itself was alive, and it was waiting. "Something's coming," Emily whispered. The air in the room grew colder with every passing second. The flickering lights on the Christmas tree cast strange, jittery shadows, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of their vision. Emily wrapped Lily tighter in the blanket, her own hands trembling. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was no longer just a home. It was something else now, something wrong. Tom stood by the tree, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the glowing lights. The strange buzzing sound persisted, its intensity growing. It wasn't coming from the tree itself, but from the walls. The electrical hum filled the space, reverberating through their bones. The house seemed to be alive, vibrating with an unseen energy. Max took a step closer to his father, his voice unsteady. "Dad, do you think we should just leave? I mean, what if we don't? What if we can't fix this?" Tom looked at him, the concern evident in his eyes, but there was a determination there too. "We're not leaving. Not yet. I have to figure this out." Emily clutched her daughter tighter. "Tom, I don't like this. The air feels heavy. There's something in this house, something not human." Tom didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the tree, his mind racing. The creature from the previous night had come and gone so quickly, almost too quickly to be real. He had to admit, even though he didn't want to, that this situation felt far more sinister than any animal intrusion could explain. Lily looked up at her father, her eyes wide and innocent. "Daddy, what's happening? Why is it so cold?" Tom knelt down beside her, brushing her hair back with his hand. "It's going to be okay, sweetie. We're going to figure this out, I promise." As he spoke, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A loud creak, followed by a series of sharp, cracking sounds that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The room groaned, as if under pressure, the foundation straining against some unseen force. Max stepped back, his heart racing. "Did you hear that? It's like the house is breaking." The room seemed to warp in front of their eyes. The familiar warmth of the house was now replaced by an oppressive cold that sank deep into their bones. The Christmas tree, once a symbol of joy, now felt like an ominous presence. The lights dimmed and brightened erratically, as if something, or someone, was manipulating them from within. "I don't think it's safe to stay here anymore," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear in her voice was unmistakable. "Tom, We need to leave. Now. But Tom stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the tree. He could feel the weight of the creature's presence, watching them from within the branches, waiting for something. He could sense its intelligence, its cunning. This wasn't a random occurrence, it was deliberate. The creature wanted them to stay. We can't leave, Tom said quietly. Not yet. We need to understand what's happening here. What if it's not just the tree? What if this house is connected to it? Max's expression turned from fear to disbelief. You're saying the house is haunted, too? This is insane, Dad. Tom turned to face his son, his eyes burning with determination. I don't know what's happening, Max. But I do know that we're not leaving without answers. Suddenly, the creature moved again. This time, it wasn't just a slight rustle among the branches, it was more pronounced. The tree seemed to tremble as the creature shifted its position, its eyes glowing brighter. The buzzing sound grew louder, almost deafening, and it seemed to reverberate in Tom's chest. Did you hear that? Emily whispered urgently, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched Lily to her chest, shielding her from the growing chaos. Tom nodded, his heart pounding. It's coming from the tree. Something's in there. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to find out. Max looked at his father, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, you're not going near that thing, are you? We don't know what it can do. But Tom didn't answer. He stepped forward, cautiously approaching the tree. Each step felt like it was pulling him deeper into something dark, something ancient. The temperature dropped even further as he neared the tree, and the air became thick with static. He could feel the electricity in the atmosphere, as if the very molecules around him were charged with fear. Emily moved closer to her daughter, trying to shield her from the growing terror. She wanted to call the police, to flee, to get out of there and never come back. But she couldn't. Something held them in place, as if the house itself was not allowing them to leave. The closer Tom got to the tree, the more oppressive the feeling became. It was as though the room was closing in around him, the walls pressing in on him with each step. He reached the base of the tree and began to inspect the branches carefully, his eyes scanning every inch for any sign of movement. Max, still standing back, called out, Dad, please, be careful. Don't touch anything. But Tom couldn't stop himself. He had to understand what was happening. He had to confront whatever was in that tree. He reached up and gently parted the branches, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual ornaments and pine needles. But then, he felt something. A slight movement, barely noticeable at first. He froze. The creature was there, hidden deep in the branches. Its eyes glowed fiercely in the dim light, watching him with an intelligence that sent a cold shiver down his spine. The creature made no sound, but it seemed to radiate malice, its presence overwhelming. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He could see it now, its tiny body, furred and misshapen, like something that didn't belong in the natural world. Its small hands, sharp and claw-like, gripped the tree branches tightly as it watched him. Emily gasped. Tom, get away from it. But Tom was already too far gone. His curiosity had taken hold of him completely, and he couldn't look away from the creature's eyes. They weren't just glowing, they were gleaming with an ancient hunger, an unholy desire. It wanted something from them, but Tom couldn't figure out what. Suddenly, the creature moved. It darted from the branches with unnatural speed, leaping at Tom in one swift motion. Before he could react, it was on him, its claws raking against his arm. Tom let out a strangled shout as he tried to push the creature off, but its grip was like iron. Max screamed, rushing to his father's side. "Dad," he yelled, his voice filled with panic. But the creature wasn't letting go. It hissed loudly, its glowing eyes fixed on Tom, and the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching longer. Emily screamed, pulling Lily close to her as she backed away from the tree. "Get off him!" Max shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it at the creature. The chair connected with a dull thud, but it didn't seem to affect the creature. It only hissed louder, its claws digging deeper into Tom's arm. The buzzing sound from the tree became deafening, and the lights flickered violently, casting the room in an eerie strobe effect. Everything felt unreal, like the very fabric of their world was unraveling. Tom gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of strength he had. He shoved the creature away, and this time, it let go, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it stood on the floor, its tiny form trembling as it stared at them with an unsettling intensity. Max rushed to help his father, pulling him away from the tree. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. Tom nodded, though his face was pale and drenched with sweat. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The creature had been real. It wasn't some figment of their imagination. "We need to get out of here," Emily said urgently, her voice trembling. "This thing, it's not just a creature. It's part of something bigger. Something evil." The room seemed to close in on them as they backed away from the tree. The creature watched them, its eyes never leaving their faces. It had done its damage. Now, it was waiting. Story 4, Haunted by the Ghost of Christmas Past. The night was cold, and the wind howled outside as the man sat alone in his dimly lit living room. His name was Edward, and for years, he had lived a life filled with regret. The weight of his past mistakes, the ones that haunted him day after day, seemed too much to bear. It was Christmas Eve, a time meant for joy, but instead, Edward found himself consumed by the shadows of his past. As he stared out the window, watching the snowflakes fall, he heard a knock at the door. It was a sound that seemed so out of place on this quiet night. Who would be visiting him at this hour? Edward hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to confront whatever was waiting on the other side. But something urged him to open the door. When he did, there was no one there. Only a chill in the air that seemed to crawl beneath his skin. But as he turned to close the door, something caught his eye. In the corner of his vision, he saw a figure standing by the tree in his living room. The ghostly figure appeared to be made of light, its features blurry but unmistakably human. Edward's heart raced. He blinked and looked again, but the figure was gone. His mind spun as he tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The figure had been too real. Too vivid. Something about the presence in his home felt familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. He could feel his pulse quicken, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He glanced nervously around the room, but there was no sign of the figure. As he sat back down on his couch, trying to calm his nerves, he heard it again, a soft whisper, like a breeze passing through the room. He looked around, expecting to see the figure, but the room was empty. His mind was racing now, but before he could gather his thoughts, the whisper came again, louder this time, almost as if someone was speaking directly into his ear. "Edward," the voice said, its tone low and sorrowful. "You've been forgotten." Edward's breath caught in his throat. The voice sounded so familiar, so distant, yet it struck a deep chord in his heart. He knew that voice, but he couldn't remember where from. His name echoed in his mind, and a wave of guilt washed over him. "Who are you?" Edward whispered, his voice trembling. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The figure reappeared. It was no longer just a blur of light, it was now clear, its features becoming more defined with each passing second. The figure was of a woman, her face soft yet marked with an expression of deep sorrow. Her eyes, filled with pain, locked onto his as she spoke again. "Do you not recognize me, Edward?" she asked, her voice as quiet as the wind outside. "I was once your wife." Edward's blood ran cold. He stared at the woman in shock, unable to speak. How could this be? His wife, Sarah, had died many years ago in a tragic accident. He had never recovered from her death, and it was her absence that haunted him most. He had never been able to forgive himself for the way he had treated her in the final years of their marriage. "Sarah?" Edward managed to choke out, his voice hoarse. "Is it really you?" The woman nodded, her face filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. "Yes, Edward. It is me." Tears welled up in Edward's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He hadn't cried since Sarah's death. He hadn't allowed himself to feel anything, burying his emotions deep within, afraid to face the pain of losing her. "I'm so sorry," Edward whispered, his voice cracking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I should have been a better husband. A better man." Sarah's ghost stepped closer to him, her presence almost tangible. "I know, Edward," she said softly. "But your guilt has kept you trapped. You've punished yourself for years, but it hasn't changed anything. I'm gone, and there's nothing you can do to bring me back." Edward's heart clenched. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he knew it wasn't possible. She was a ghost, something he could never touch, never hold. The sadness he had been carrying all these years, the weight of his regrets, seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. "But how?" Edward asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why are you here? Why now, on Christmas Eve?" Sarah's ghost smiled faintly, her expression one of deep sorrow. "I've come to show you something, Edward. Something that you've forgotten. You can't keep running from your past forever. You have to confront it, or it will destroy you." The room seemed to grow darker as Sarah's words hung in the air. Edward looked around, feeling the oppressive weight of the darkness closing in around him. He wanted to ask more questions, to beg for answers, but he knew that Sarah's ghost wasn't here to offer comfort. She had come to reveal a truth, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "Confront it?" Edward repeated, his voice trembling. "What do you mean? What do I need to do?" Sarah's ghost extended her hand toward him, her fingers translucent but filled with a strange power. "Come with me, Edward," she said softly. "I will show you what you have been hiding from all these years." Without thinking, Edward stood up and took a step toward her. He didn't know why, he didn't even fully understand what was happening. But there was something in her eyes, something that made him believe she could help him. He reached out, his trembling hand closing around hers. The moment their hands touched, the room seemed to shift. The walls disappeared, and Edward found himself standing in a different place. The air smelled different, as if he had been transported to another world. The room was dimly lit, but there was something familiar about it. He glanced around and realized that he was standing in their old home, the one he and Sarah had shared before everything had gone wrong. "This is where it all began, Edward," Sarah's voice echoed, soft and distant. "This is where you made your first mistake." Edward's heart began to race. He hadn't thought about this house in years. It was as though the memory of it had been buried deep inside him, locked away in a part of his mind he had tried to forget. He walked through the familiar rooms, his footsteps hollow in the silence. He entered the living room, where he and Sarah had spent so many happy nights together, before the distance between them had grown. He remembered the arguments, the harsh words, the things he had said in anger that he could never take back. He had been so focused on his own bitterness and resentment that he had forgotten the love they once shared. "This is the room where it all fell apart," Sarah said, her voice full of sorrow. "Do you remember, Edward? Do you remember how we used to laugh here? How we used to dream together?" Edward closed his eyes, trying to block out the painful memories. "I remember," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I remember everything." The room seemed to darken further, the shadows growing longer as the past unfolded before him. He could see the arguments, hear the angry words exchanged between him and Sarah. He had been so consumed by his own frustrations that he hadn't seen how much he was hurting her. He hadn't realized that the love they shared was slipping away until it was too late. Sarah's ghost moved closer, her form flickering like a candle flame. "It wasn't just the big things, Edward. It was the little things. The times I needed you, and you were too wrapped up in your own anger to see it. You didn't protect me. You didn't love me the way I needed you to." Edward felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his chest. The guilt, the shame, the self-loathing, all of it came crashing down at once. He had failed her, and now, in the stillness of the night, he was forced to face the consequences of his actions. "I was selfish," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I pushed you away. I didn't love you the way you deserved." Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. He had nothing left to hide. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Sarah." Her face softened, and she took a step closer. "I know, Edward. But now you have to let go. You can't keep holding on to the past. You have to forgive yourself, or you will never find peace." Edward stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking deep into his soul. He didn't know if he could ever forgive himself, but he knew that Sarah was right. He couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep punishing himself for his mistakes. The room began to fade, and Sarah's ghost started to vanish, her form flickering like a dying light. "I will always be with you, Edward," she whispered softly, her voice barely audible. "But you have to move forward. You have to live your life." As the last of her presence faded, Edward was left standing alone in the dark, his heart heavy but somehow lighter than it had been in years. He understood now. The past could never be changed, but he could change how he carried it.